Hey folks, alright. Well, this time around I want to go through the details on the project for the course for this semester. So this is something that you're going to be doing on your own. It's a more involved program. There's a fair bit going on with arrays and strings and that kind of thing. It's due at the very end of semester, so I think 9 p.m. on the last day of classes, which I think is December 10th, if I remember correctly. And again, I want you to go through and come up with a good design for your solution, write good code, right? It's going to have to follow the code standards to get full marks, but most of you are getting pretty darn good at following the code standards already, so I'm not too concerned there. You will get the project in the same way that you've been getting your labs. So if you go to your home directory, so CD to get into your home directory, and do your make-f, make 160, and then the CSCI 160/project, that'll go off and get the project repository. And it's got some content in it for you in the beginning. So once you get it, you'll see that there's the contents include a makefile as usual, project.cpp that's again pretty much just empty. It's got a comment in it at the beginning. And it's also got an effects.h file in there. And that one, you don't have to use this at all. It's just if you're looking for something a little bit more fun to play with in terms of the code. I'm just going to show you a little bit of the content here. Again, I've written this for you. What it basically provides you with, if you kind of skip the blurb at the beginning, it provides you with a bunch of different functions that you can call. So you hash include the effects.h. There's a function called syspause that'll just pause the program for a fraction of a second. There's a function called move cursor, so you can get the cursor to jump around to different spots on the screen. So you specify which row and column on the terminal window you want it to jump to. Function to go through and figure out how big the terminal window is, so you can figure out what size window the user is working with. One to clear the window. One's to change the text color and the background color. And so there's just a bunch of different functions that you can use to play with if you want to. There are also a couple of input routines in there that don't require the user to hit enter whenever they want to type a key. So if you want them to hit, character C or something like that and have the program continue as soon as they type it instead of making them hit C, enter, you can do that. So again, this stuff isn't stuff that you have to use, but it's there if you want it. So in terms of the program itself, let me just ditch this for a second. So again, what this program is going to be doing is we're doing a little bit of timeline analysis here. So we've got two universes going on. We've got kind of an original universe, a main universe, and a second universe. And people are born and they die in each of the two universes. So, the idea is, Bob gets born in 1921 and dies in 2029 or something like that in one universe. And all is kind of fairly fine and normal. But we're assuming people can conceivably move between universes at some point, or they can conceivably time travel. So they can technically, be born in one universe and die in the other one, or they can be born in, at some date in their universe and die earlier by time traveling. So what your program is doing is reading just a list of who was born in which universe when, who died in which universe when, and you're trying to spot anomalies, trying to spot places where somebody was born in one universe and died in the other one, and places where somebody was born after they died. So that's the idea. Most of the details here are just kind of fleshing out the specifications. So there's details on exactly the format that the user is going to be typing things in using. So the user is going to specify a date. So you can kind of think of this as a year and a fraction. So 207.9 is 0.9 of the way through year 207. So just to make it a little easy on the input for dates. So treating the input date as a float or a double, whichever data type you like. And then they're going to specify which universe. So it's either going to be the word alternate or the word original. And then they're going to specify whether somebody was born or died, so it's either going to be birth or death. And then they're going to give the person's name. And we'll assume for the purposes of this program that no two people ever have the exact same name. So this is the idea, and there's just going to be a whole bunch of lines of input like this, just listing, date, universe, what kind of event, and who. And the idea is the entries will always be going kind of forward in time. So the first entry will always be the earliest time across the two beasts, and then the next one will be later than that, and the next one will be later than that, etc., etc., etc. And when the user's finally finished giving you all of their input, they're going to type in this one word, end of time. Right? So you're going to go through and you're going to read and store all of this information, and you're going to figure out if there were any kind of weird events, any kinds of anomalies that took place. And again, doing it using a well-designed program. So I'm not too fussed on, so for the core marks for the project, I'm going to assume that the user gives you valid input. So they actually give you a float for the date, and they're always going up in time. They always give you the word alternate or original for the universe, the word birth or death for the kind of event, and then a string for whatever the name is. And then they always give you this end of time at the end. If you get all of the core functionality working and you want to start putting in fancier error checking to see, well, what happens if the user screws up the input? Can I detect that and give them an error message and keep going? That would be kind of a next objective. But just focus on the core functionality first, and then if you've got time, go to fancier bells and whistles later. So that's essentially the idea. I want to run through a couple of little bits and pieces in terms of code that might give you a hand getting started with this. So I'm just going to play a little bit here with the project.cpp file. So I've thrown a few extra bits and pieces in this already. So yours is going to come out initially much emptier than this. One of the things that I think I did in the skeleton, the version that you get in the beginning, was to include that effects.h, so you can use it if you want to. So that's the syntax for including a local file. So if there's a header file that's got definitions for you, you can include it like this. So this is just, you can get rid of this if you're not using the effects.h. You don't have to, still add whatever other hash includes you need to. So in terms of getting going on this, again, we want to go through and follow good practices. So we want to use constants instead of hard-coded values. So I'm probably going to assume that you're using a bunch of arrays to keep track of all of the different information, right? An array of all of the events that took place, an array of the names, an array of the dates, that kind of thing. So I'll talk about that in a second. But that means that we're going to have a maximum size for our array. Pick anything reasonable. I'm going to say up 100 for now. So I'm going to assume that this program works on anything up to 100 entries, for instance. And then there's a few hard-coded strings that we're expecting from the user, right? We're expecting them to actually enter birth as to indicate that it's a birth, or death for a death, or original or alternate for the names of the universes. So I'm going to create constants for those so that in the rest of the program, if I need to refer to the string for alternate, I'll just use alt, or the string for original, I'll just use orig. And that way, if somewhere down the road I decide to modify these things and have a different keyword that the user enters for a birth or a death, or add more of them or something like that, then I can just modify my constants. So again, just a reminder in terms of the standards, this is a good place to throw in some the use of some constants. And of course, this does mean that that we're going to be going through and probably, if I'm using these things, then it looks like I'm using string, and I'm probably also going to be using IOStream, and I'm probably also going to be needing my standard namespace. So don't forget all that stuff. I mean, obviously it's not going to compile if you don't, but anyway. So we go through and get things set up. In this little code snippet that I'm going to go through and discuss, I'm just putting everything in one big main. You're going to want to design properly with functions and parameters, but I just want to show you some ideas for syntax. So the way I see it, we've got a whole bunch of dates, a whole bunch of events, births and deaths, a whole bunch of universe choices, alternate or original, and a whole bunch of names that we need to store. So what I'm going to do, I think, is to go through and say, well, I'm going to keep track of how many entries I've read in, and for each entry, I'm going to store the name, the universe, the kind of event, and the date in the different arrays. So I'll have an array of floats for the dates, an array of strings for the events, an array of strings for the universe, etc. And then what I'll do is when I read in an entry, let's say I read in the first entry, then in position 0, I'm going to put the date in this array for that event, the event type, birth or death, which universe it was, and which name. So position 0 contains all the information for that first event. And then I go through and read another one and put all that information in the next position, in position 1. So in position 1, I'll find the date of the next event, what kind of event it was, what universe it was, and what name it was. Right? So position I for the ith entry, or let's say for entry I, for entry number I starting at 0, dates I contains the date of the event, events I specifies birth or death, universe I tells me which universe it was in, so this is going to specify, I can't type, specifies original or alternate, and names I specifies who. Right, so the ith entry has all of the information for that ith event as I'm reading it in. So what that means is later on, if I want to look up information about what happened at date 207.9 or something like that, then I'm looking in the events array in the same position, or in the universe array in the same position, in the names array in the same position. So that's how I've got things broken down. Now, later in the course, probably late November, we'll be going through the use of structs, which will give us a much more compact way to store all this information together, to group all the information for an event together. But we won't get to that till late November. So if you want to kind of do your own investigation of structs or of classes and come up with a better organization, feel free. But barring that, this is probably a reasonable structure I'd suggest for going through and setting things up. So what I would be inclined to do is to go through and read in all of the events that the user types in until they type in that end of time thing, and put all of the information in the different arrays here. So you've got all of your data stored and ready to go. And once you've read it all in, then go back and start looking for anomalies. Start going through the events and seeing if you can figure out if anything's screwy in there. So you've got that first part where you're going to go through and read in all that user input. So you're going to have some kind of a loop that just says, okay, let's keep going until we see end of time. And so for each pass through this, if we've got some big outer loop here, I'm going to want to read in, again, if you recall, the format was the user was going to enter a date, a universe, a kind of event, birth or death, and a name. So for each pass through this, I want to read those 4 pieces of information. And maybe I decide I'm just going to read them in as strings so I don't have to worry about cin.fail and all that kind of thing. So I'll have variables for the name, the universe, which universe, what kind of event, what the date was, and I'll read in the date. And I'd have been inclined to say read in all 4 pieces, but remember that they could have had that end of time string. So once I've read in the date, I'll see if that was actually end of time and not a new full entry. So I'd throw in a check to see, and again, I'm just using whatever my constant was up here, maybe I've got a, oops, so let's say I had a constant up here for, end of time was, I think, the string that the user was going to enter if they were done. So if they're done, then you can leave this loop. I don't know, maybe you've got some processing to clean up here, but test and see if you're done, if this is the end of the entries. Otherwise, we want to go through and get those other fields. We want to get which universe it was, which kind of event, birth or death, and which name. So just read those in. And again, in the basic version, we're not worried about error checking, so we can assume this is all there and we can read it all in. An alternative that you could use if you want to is to use something like the cin.getLine to go through and read in the whole line and then read the pieces out of that using something like iStringStream. But again, it's totally your choice. And again, if you've got the basics working and you want to start introducing error checking, this would be a good place, right? You do your cin.getLine and see if you can read all 4 fields and if they're all valid and all that kind of thing. But again, that's after you've got the basic functionality working. So then I'd be going through and saying, okay, well, I want to keep this information in my my different arrays in the right spots. So I'm going to say, okay, well, I want to add the name at the current spot in my names array, the date in my current spot, what kind of event it was. Ooh, I guess I need my universe here too, right? Which universe this is, the universe, and for the entry that I'm on right now. And again, I'm starting num entries off at 0, and I'm just updating it every time I kind of make another pass, every time I read another user input. And then just bump up my count of how many entries there are. So again, you've just got all of this in a loop that's cycling through and reading it all in. And again, I'm presuming that you're using functions appropriately, so you're probably actually, your main routine is just calling some function to say, go get the user input and passing it the 4 arrays, right? Something like that. So, and then after that, we want to start going through those arrays to see if we can find any anomalies. So I would pick one of those 4 arrays and say, all right, for each entry in the array, I'm going to go through and see if that entry represents some kind of an anomaly. So let's say I go through the positions for I is 0 and I is less than the number of entries. For each one, I'm going to see if that one entry represents an anomaly. So what I can do is say, well, for my current event, for the ith event that I'm on right now, look up the name and the date and the event type and the universe, which universe it was in. And then I can go through the array, the kind of 4 arrays again, looking to see if there's an anomaly. So let's say, I don't know, maybe for each birth, I go through the whole array, and anytime I land on a birth, then I say, well, let's see if I can find where the death is that corresponds to that birth, right? So I look up, so I get the name for I, and which universe it was in, and what the date was, and then I do a search through my 4 arrays with another loop, right, to go through these. Maybe I only search the ones that come later, and so I see if I'm on the death now and I go through and find the birth later, it's an error. Or in this case, if I see the birth now and I go through the rest and there isn't a death, then I've got some kind of an error. But I'm going to go through the 4 arrays, and so I just have another loop inside here that's saying for each position, 0 to num entries, see if I can find something, an event that's a death that has the same name. And if I do, then I look at which universe it was in. If it's not the right universe, then that's an anomaly. I look and see what the date was, and if the date of death is before the date of birth, then that's an anomaly. So again, I essentially have just a nested loop going on here. For each position in events I, where I find a birth, go through for each position in events, look at each position J in events, and if I find a death with the same name, look at the date and look at the universe. And that would be kind of the nutshell approach I would take to solving this. Right? So again, there's a fair bit going on here. Nothing is too totally hideous, but there's a fair bit to keep track of, and you're using arrays, and you're using nested loops, and you're using strings. So this is something where I would recommend, again, flesh out the design that you want to use. Think about what functions you want to create. Get the basics of those working, right? Get a function, maybe get a function working to just read a single user entry. Right? Then get your functions working to get the user's input and put them into sort of the current position in each of the arrays. Right? Then get a loop going through to read in all the entries. And once you're able to fill all of the arrays, then you've got half the battle done, and you can start the process of writing a function to just go through and maybe just print out each birth. Right? So you can go through and see that you're actually finding all the births, and then for that, go through and say, okay, well now let's see if I can write something that, given a single birth, can find the matching death. And so this would be the approach I think I would take for this. All right, we've got, again, about month and a half, just under a month and a half, to go through and implement this one. I totally don't mind having a look at what you're going, or to just or what you've got going at different points. So if you get partway through the code and run into problems, or get through partway through the design and run into problems and want to come talk about it, absolutely. This is again an interesting problem to try and tackle as on your own and without too many gory details on how you can go through and do it. All right, I will leave it there. Again, do get started early just to make sure that you don't get surprised with anything nasty towards the end, and we'll see how we go.